In last November's presidential election, Donald Trump defeated Kamala Harris to become the 47th president of the U.S. Trump's second term is expected to further highlight his America First approach. In Korea, concerns are rising over the diplomatic and economic impact the new administration will have on the Korean peninsula. In diplomacy and national defense, as Trump has publicly stated, the new government is expected to demand a higher share from South Korea for the expense of U.S. troops stationed there. Also, Trump's previous statements that he can handle the North Korean nuclear issue by maintaining a close relationship with Kim Jong-un risk isolating Seoul from communications between Washington and Pyongyang. Repercussions in economy and trade are expected to be more serious. Characterized by protectionism and a focus on domestic production, the economic policies of Trump's second term will exacerbate the troubles of Korea's export-dependent economy. Also, with the scaling back of the previous Democratic administration's eco-friendly policies, Korea's environmental industry will be hit. As Albert Einstein once said, "In the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity." However, Trump's inauguration and its impact on Korea's diplomacy, security, and economy may prove to be a tall order. The power shift in the U.S. may change the everyday lives of even Koreans. That's right. You could also say, with the Trump administration increasing protectionist measures, Korea's export-driven economy might encounter challenges. So by protectionist measures, these are one form of protectionism. A protectionist measure might be something like a policy with tariffs on imports, subsidies for domestic producers, and so on. Each of these policies seek to protect the interests of the local economy or the domestic economy against outsiders. When we say export-driven, we mean an economy that's driven by or pushed forward by exports. So Korea has an export-driven economy, which means that its economy relies on exports. It's driven by exports in order to function. We can also say the Korean economy, which relies heavily on exports, may face obstacles as the Trump administration strengthens its protectionist stance. So A relies on B. In this case, the Korean economy relies on exports. That means it needs exports to survive. And when we say that the economy faces obstacles, we mean that there are challenges for the economy. And why is that? Because there is more protectionism from the US. The Trump administration has a protectionist stance. By stance, we mean position. So in other words, it is Trump's stance that the US should prioritize its own interests over the interests of others such as Korea. Exactly. Another way to say that is, as the Trump administration plans to undo the former government's pro-environment approach, Korea's eco-friendly businesses in the US market will be severely impacted. When we say undo something, that means to reverse it or to cancel it. So Trump plans to undo or cancel the previous government's or Biden's approach to the economy, which takes a pro-environment or environmentally friendly approach. By doing that, Trump moves from a pro-environment approach to a pro-industry approach. What do we mean when we say pro-industry? Basically non-eco-friendly. So the traditional industries that rely on fossil fuels, for example, that's oil, coal, or gas. You may have heard Trump say, "Drill, baby, drill." By that, he's saying, let's go out and drill for more oil, more fossil fuels to supply our energy needs. That, of course, is not very environmentally friendly, but it would help the economy. Other industries might be manufacturing and even the food supply. So, for example, livestock farming, fishing, and others that have a strong impact on the environment, negative impacts. Another way to say it is, The anticipated rollback of environmental policies by the Trump administration will heavily affect Korea's green industries that have been making inroads into the US market. So anticipated rollback, we mean expected cancellation. To roll back something, as you remember, is to cancel it, to make it go in reverse. And it, in this context, is the environmental policy, the set of policies that were enacted by the previous administration. What will that do? That will heavily affect the green industries of Korea. So green industries is another way of saying eco-friendly or environmentally friendly and sustainable industries. What have these industries been doing in recent years? They've been making inroads into the US market. When we say to make inroads into something, we mean to make progress in a new area. So if you think of building a new road into a new direction, that's making inroads into something. It's entering into a new market. In this case, the US market. Yes, and another way to say that would be the new government might call on Korea to accept more of the financial burden for US troops stationed there. Threatening to withdraw troops could be used as a negotiating tactic. So if the new government calls on Korea to do something, it is asking, but in a strong way, close to demanding something. Countries normally call on other countries to do certain things in the strongest terms. So in this case, Trump would call on Korea to accept more financial burden. So there already is a financial burden which is shared by both Korea and the US for the US troops that are stationed in Korea. By accepting more financial burden, that means Korea would take on more of the costs. It would have to pay more for these troops. That would in turn lessen the financial burden of the US. So the US would have to pay less. And then we have a threat, right? What is the threat? Troop withdrawal. So threatening to take the troops out of Korea could be used as a negotiating tactic. A tactic is a strategy. So in this case, a strategy of negotiating. A strategy that might push Korea to accept the US demands. Lastly, we could say the new government may push for greater financial contribution toward the US military presence in Korea. The US could use the threat of troop withdrawal as a means of pressure. So again, here we're pushing for something, which means advocating something in strong terms. And that thing in this context is more money, so greater financial contribution. Korea is contributing financially to this US military presence, as is the US. But the new government wants more of that. And there is the possibility that the US could use the threat of withdrawing its troops as a means of pressure. So a means is another word for a method, and pressure is one means or method to do something. In this case, to negotiate or to push for greater financial contribution. You've got it. A shorter way to say that would be expanding direct communication between Washington and Pyongyang could alienate Seoul. So when you expand the communication, that means you either make the current lines of communication bigger or you add more of them. Doing this would then possibly alienate Seoul. When you alienate someone or something, that means you push them to the outside. Think about an alien, right? What is that? An alien is a being from outer space, so they are on the outside. In a way, you could think of this expansion of direct communication as a way of making Seoul an alien. And when we say Seoul, we of course mean South Korea, just as when we mean US when we say Washington and North Korea when we say Pyongyang. The last way we could say this is, if more lines of communication are established between Washington and Pyongyang, Seoul might end up being marginalized. So again, we have the prospect of adding more ways to communicate directly between Washington and Pyongyang, and that action might marginalize Seoul. When you marginalize someone or something, that also means pushing them to the edge in this case. So think of a sheet of paper. When you write a letter, there are margins. That is, on the edges, a certain amount of white space where the text does not go. So when you marginalize someone or something, you are pushing them to that white space. That white space is on the edge or on the outside.